If we want to understand who controls the future of oil, we have to start by recognizing that the nature of control itself has changed. For much of modern history, control over oil meant something relatively straightforward: ownership of reserves. Countries with large oil deposits had power, influence, and leverage. But that model, while still relevant, no longer tells the full story. Today, control is far more distributed and far more complex. We've moved from a world where the key question was who has the oil to one where the more important question is who controls the system that moves, processes, and prices the oil. Because in a globalized economy, control is no longer just about what sits beneath the ground. It's about everything that happens after the oil is extracted. This includes infrastructure, pipelines, shipping routes, storage facilities. It includes refining capacity, which determines how crude oil is transformed into usable products. And it includes financial systems, the trading hubs, the contracts, the benchmarks that determine how oil is priced and exchanged across the world. So power has shifted, not away from oil, but within it. And that shift is subtle but profound, because what it means is that influence is no longer concentrated in the same way it once was. A country with vast reserves still matters, of course, but without access to markets, without the ability to transport oil efficiently, without integration into global financial systems, that resource alone does not guarantee control. This creates a new kind of geopolitical landscape, one where power is shared across multiple layers. And now think about what that means in practice. A country that controls a major shipping route has influence over global flows. A country that controls refining capacity can shape supply chains. A country that dominates financial markets can influence pricing mechanisms. And a country with technological advantages in extraction or efficiency can change the economics of production itself. Each of these layers represents a form of control. And when you combine them, you begin to see that the future of oil is not determined by a single actor, but by a network of actors, each with their own leverage points. This is where the concept of interdependence becomes critical. No country, no matter how powerful, controls the entire system. But many countries control parts of it, and those parts, when combined, create the global energy architecture we all depend on. What Ian Bremmer often highlights is that we are living in a G0 world, a world where there is no single dominant power capable of enforcing global stability. In such a world, control is fragmented, and that fragmentation creates both opportunity and risk, because when control is distributed, coordination becomes more difficult, and when coordination becomes more difficult, uncertainty increases. This is particularly important when we think about energy markets. Oil is not just a physical commodity. It is a globally traded financial asset. It moves through contracts, through speculation, through expectations about future supply and demand. And that means control is not just about physical access. It's about influence over expectations. And who can shape those expectations? Who can signal stability or instability? Who can influence how markets interpret risk? These are the new questions of power, and they are just as important as the old ones. Now, from a psychological perspective, this shift changes how actors behave. In a system where control is concentrated, the strategy is often straightforward: secure as much of the resource as possible. But in a system where control is distributed, the strategy becomes more complex. Actors must think not only about ownership, but about access. Not only about production, but about distribution. Not only about capacity, but about influence. This requires a different kind of thinking, a more adaptive, more strategic approach to power. And it also introduces a new layer of competition. Because countries are not just competing over oil itself. They are competing over the mechanisms that determine how oil moves, how it is priced, and how it is used. This is where we begin to see the emergence of energy strategy as a core component of national security. By zero, energy is no longer just an economic input. It is a geopolitical tool. And control over energy systems translates into broader influence over global affairs. But here's the deeper philosophical point. Control in this context is not absolute. It is conditional. It depends on relationships, on agreements, on systems that are constantly evolving. And that means control can shift. It can expand. It can contract. It can move between actors over time. So when we talk about who controls the future of oil, we are not describing a fixed answer. We are describing a dynamic system, a system in which power is constantly being negotiated, adjusted, and redefined. And that creates both opportunity and instability, because in a dynamic system, no position is permanent, no advantage is guaranteed, and no actor can afford to be complacent. The future of oil, then, is not just about who has the most resources. It's about who understands the system best, who can navigate its complexity, who can adapt to its changes, and who can anticipate where it is going next. Because in a world where control is no longer centralized, the real power lies in the ability to move with the system, not against it. And that is where the future will be decided. If control over oil is no longer just about possession, then the next question becomes even more important. How is that control used? And this is where we enter a more strategic and at times more unsettling dimension of the global energy landscape. Because oil is not just an economic resource, it is a geopolitical instrument. And like any instrument of power, it can be used, leveraged, and in some cases weaponized. We've seen this dynamic before, but what's different now is the scale and the sophistication with which it operates. Energy is no longer just part of the background of geopolitics. It is at the center of it. And when tensions rise, particularly in regions like the Middle East, energy becomes one of the first tools that countries consider in responding to pressure. And this is not always done openly. In fact, some of the most effective uses of energy as a geopolitical tool are subtle. Production decisions, export policies, pricing strategies, these can all be adjusted in ways that send signals to the global system without a single direct confrontation, and markets are highly sensitive to those signals. Because when a major producer signals that supply might tighten even slightly, it creates a ripple effect. Prices begin to adjust, importing countries reassess their strategies, competitors respond, and what starts as a policy decision becomes a global economic signal. This is the essence of what we mean when we talk about the weaponization of energy. And it's not about cutting off supply entirely. That would be too blunt, too destabilizing for most actors. And instead, it's about creating leverage. It's about using energy flows as a way to influence behavior, to shape negotiations, to gain strategic advantage without crossing the threshold into outright conflict. And this is where psychology plays a critical role, because power is not just about what you can do, it's about what others believe you are capable of doing. The perception of control is often just as important as actual control. If markets, governments, and competitors believe that a country has the ability to disrupt supply, that belief alone can shift behavior. That's why even the suggestion of production cuts, sanctions, or export restrictions can have immediate effects. It doesn't require full implementation. The signal itself is enough to alter expectations. Now, think about how this interacts with global interdependence. In a highly interconnected world, countries depend on each other in ways that create both cooperation and vulnerability. When energy becomes a tool of influence, that dependency can be leveraged. And when it is, it introduces a layer of strategic complexity into relationships that might otherwise be purely economic. This is where alliances begin to shift. Countries start to reassess their energy partnerships. They look for more reliable sources. They consider diversification not just as an economic strategy, but as a geopolitical necessity, because relying too heavily on a single supplier introduces risk, not just in terms of price, but in terms of access and stability. And this is where the broader realignment begins. What Ian Bremmer often points out is that we are living in a world where geopolitical risk is no longer an exception. It is a constant factor. And in such a world, energy becomes one of the primary tools through which that risk is expressed and managed. So when we talk about energy being weaponized, we are not just talking about conflict. We are talking about influence. We are talking about negotiation. We are talking about the ability to shape outcomes without direct confrontation, and that ability is powerful because it allows countries to exert pressure while maintaining a degree of deniability. It allows them to influence global markets without necessarily triggering a crisis. And it allows them to navigate complex geopolitical environments in ways that maximize their strategic position. But there is a trade-off, because when energy is used as a tool of leverage, it also introduces instability into the system. Markets respond to uncertainty, and when energy flows become a source of uncertainty, that uncertainty spreads. Prices become more volatile. Investment decisions become more cautious. Long-term planning becomes more difficult. And over time, the system itself becomes more reactive. This creates a feedback loop. The more energy is used as a geopolitical tool, the more sensitive the market becomes. And the more sensitive the market becomes, the greater the impact of each new signal. So even small decisions can have large consequences. This is where the philosophical dimension becomes important. We often think of power in terms of control, of having the ability to direct outcomes. But in a system like this, power is also about responsibility. Because the decisions made by energy-producing countries don't just affect their own economies, they affect the global system. And that system is fragile. It depends on balance. It depends on predictability. It depends on a level of cooperation, even among competitors. When that balance is disrupted, the effects are not contained. They spread. This is why energy policy is no longer just about economics. It is about strategy. It is about diplomacy. It is about understanding the broader implications of each decision. And it requires a different kind of leadership, one that recognizes the interconnected nature of the system, one that understands that using energy as a tool of influence can yield short-term gains, but may also contribute to long-term instability, and one that is willing to consider not just what can be done, but what should be done. Because in the end, the question is not whether energy can be weaponized. It already is. The question is how it will be used and at what cost. And that is a decision that will shape not just markets, but the future of global stability itself. If the first two dynamics we've discussed are about control and influence, then the third is about response, how the rest of the world adapts when the rules of the game begin to change. Because when energy becomes a geopolitical tool, countries don't just observe, they react. And increasingly, that reaction is centered around one goal: reducing dependence and increasing autonomy. What we're witnessing today is not just a shift in energy markets, it's a strategic reorientation of entire nations. So countries are no longer asking only, where can we get the cheapest energy? They are asking a deeper question: where can we get the most secure energy? And those two questions don't always lead to the same answer. This is where the concept of energy independence becomes central. Energy independence is not just about producing more oil or gas domestically. It's about control over supply, stability over time, and resilience in the face of disruption. It's about ensuring that a country is not overly exposed to external shocks, whether those shocks come from conflict, sanctions, or supply chain disruptions. And this shift is happening across the world. Major economies are investing heavily in diversifying their energy sources. Some are expanding domestic production. Others are building strategic reserves. Many are accelerating investment in alternative energy, renewables, nuclear, and emerging technologies that can reduce reliance on imported fossil fuels. But this is not just an economic shift. It is a geopolitical one. Because as countries reduce their dependence on traditional energy suppliers, they are also reducing the leverage that those suppliers once held. And that in turn reshapes alliances, trade relationships, and even political alignments. This is where the system begins to reconfigure itself. Countries that were once central to global energy flows may find their influence gradually changing. Meanwhile, new players, those investing in technology, infrastructure, and innovation, begin to gain strategic importance. Power becomes more distributed, but also more contested. And this creates a new kind of competition, not just over resources, but over resilience. Because in this environment, the most successful countries are not necessarily those with the most resources, but those that are best prepared for uncertainty. Those that can absorb shocks, those that can adapt quickly when conditions change. What Ian Bremmer often emphasizes is that in today's geopolitical landscape, adaptability is a form of power, and that is especially true in the context of energy. Countries that can pivot quickly by adjusting their energy mix, securing new partnerships, or investing in alternative technologies are better positioned to navigate periods of instability. They are less vulnerable to external pressures, and they are more capable of maintaining economic and political stability when the system comes under stress. But this transition is not without challenges. Building energy independence takes time. It requires investment, coordination, and long-term planning. And during the transition, countries often find themselves navigating a delicate balance between current dependencies and future autonomy. This creates tension, because while the long-term goal is resilience, the short-term reality is often vulnerability. And in that gap between the present and the future, geopolitical dynamics play a critical role. Countries may seek to accelerate their transition by forming new alliances. Regional partnerships become more important. Energy corridors are redefined. Trade agreements are adjusted to reflect new priorities. At the same time, competition intensifies because as some countries move toward greater independence, others may seek to maintain their influence. This can lead to a reconfiguration of global relationships, not necessarily through conflict, but through strategic positioning. And that positioning matters because in a system where energy flows define economic stability, the ability to influence those flows is a form of power. So what we are seeing is not just a move toward independence, it is a broader realignment of the global energy map. And this realignment is still in progress. We are in a transition phase, and transitions are inherently uncertain. Old systems are being challenged, but new systems are not yet fully established. That creates a space where competition, innovation, and risk all increase simultaneously. From a psychological perspective, this is a moment of heightened awareness. Countries are more conscious of their vulnerabilities. They are more aware of the risks associated with dependency, and they are more motivated to act not just in response to immediate threats, but in anticipation of future ones. This forward-looking mindset is crucial because energy independence is not something that can be achieved overnight. It requires a vision of the future and a willingness to invest in that future even when the benefits are not immediately visible. And that is where leadership becomes critical. Leadership that can look beyond short-term fluctuations. Leadership that can balance immediate needs with long-term strategy. Leadership that understands that resilience is not just about surviving the next shock, but about preparing for the shocks that have not yet occurred. This is not just a policy challenge. It is a philosophical one. because it forces us to reconsider how we think about security, about growth, and about interdependence. For decades, the global system has been built on the idea that connection reduces risk. And while that is true in many cases, it is also incomplete because connection also creates exposure. And the more connected the system becomes, the more important it is to ensure that it remains resilient. So the move toward energy independence is not a rejection of globalization. It is an evolution of it, a recognition that in a world defined by uncertainty, resilience matters as much as efficiency, and that the future will belong to those who can balance both. Because in the end, energy independence is not just about who controls supply, it's about who controls their own stability. And that may be the most important form of control in the world we are entering. When we talk about the future of oil, we often fall into a familiar trap, thinking in terms of decline or continuity. Will oil remain dominant or will it be replaced? But that framing misses the deeper transformation underway. Because what we are really witnessing is not just an energy transition, it is a redistribution of power. Oil is not disappearing, not anytime soon, but its role in shaping global power is evolving. And in that evolution lies something far more significant than a simple shift in energy sources. For over a century, oil has been the backbone of industrial growth, military strength, and economic expansion. It has underpinned the rise of superpowers and the fall of empires. Control over oil has often meant control over global influence, but today that control is becoming more complex, more fragmented, and more contested. The transition to alternative energy sources, solar, wind, nuclear, hydrogen, is not just about sustainability. It is about strategic independence. It is about reducing vulnerability. And it is about redefining what it means to be powerful in the 21st century. What makes this moment so unique is that the transition is not linear, it is uneven. Some countries are accelerating forward, investing heavily in new technologies and infrastructure. Others remain heavily dependent on traditional energy systems. And many are caught in between, navigating the tension between the old world and the new. This creates a dynamic environment where power is constantly shifting. And in that shifting landscape, the countries that will define the future are not necessarily those that dominate oil production today, but those that understand how to adapt to the transition itself. Because adaptation is where real power lies. This is where we see a fundamental realignment of influence. Traditional oil exporting nations are no longer just energy providers. They are becoming strategic players in a more complex system. At the same time, energy importing nations are no longer passive consumers. They are actively reshaping their energy strategies to gain greater control over their futures. And then there are the innovators, the countries and companies that are investing in the technologies that will define the next era of energy. So these actors are not just participating in the energy transition, they are shaping it. What Ian Bremmer often points out is that we are moving into a world where power is more diffuse, but also more interconnected. No single country can dominate the system the way some did in the past. Instead, influence is shared across networks, economic, technological, and geopolitical, and that changes everything. Because in a distributed system, control is not about dominance, it is about positioning. It is about where you stand in relation to others. It is about the alliances you build, the technologies you develop, and the strategies you pursue. And it is about how quickly you can respond when the system changes around you. This is where the concept of transition becomes critical. Transition is not a destination, it is a process. And in that process, uncertainty is inevitable. Markets fluctuate, policies shift, technologies evolve, and geopolitical tensions rise and fall. But within that uncertainty lies opportunity, because transitions create openings. They allow new players to emerge, they allow existing players to redefine themselves, and they allow systems to be rebuilt in ways that better reflect current realities. However, transitions also create risk because they challenge established structures, they disrupt existing power balances, and they force difficult decisions about investment, about policy, and about long-term strategy. This is where leadership becomes essential. Not leadership that reacts to every short-term fluctuation, but leadership that understands the broader trajectory. Leadership that recognizes that the decisions made today will shape the energy landscape for decades to come. And perhaps more importantly, leadership that understands that the future is not predetermined. It is constructed through choices, through investments, and through cooperation. But let's be clear, the future of oil is not simply a story of decline. It is a story of transformation. Oil will continue to play a role in the global economy for years, even decades, but its influence will be shaped by how it fits into a broader energy ecosystem, one that includes renewables, storage technologies, and new forms of energy production. And in that ecosystem, power will not belong to a single resource. It will belong to those who can navigate complexity, those who can integrate multiple energy sources, those who can balance economic growth with environmental responsibility, and those who can manage the geopolitical implications of energy in a rapidly changing world, because energy is no longer just about power in the literal sense. It is about power in the strategic sense. It is about influence. It is about stability. And it is about the ability to shape outcomes in an increasingly interconnected system. So when we ask who controls the future of oil, we are really asking a broader question. Who controls the transition? Who controls the pace of change? Who defines the rules of the next energy order? And perhaps most importantly, who adapts quickly enough to remain relevant in that order? Because in the end, control is not static. It moves, it shifts, it evolves, and those who understand that will not just survive the transition, they will shape it. And that is the real energy war, not over oil itself, but over the future it is becoming. The question is not just who controls oil today, it is who is prepared to control what comes next,